So, ever since the early to mid 2000s, I've been a massive fan of the anime Yu Yu Hakusho. With its unique and intricate characters, as well as its highly captivating arcs, the fact that it continues to stand as one of the most iconic and influential anime comes to many fans of this series as no shock. However, with the conclusion of this beloved series, or honestly any popular battle shonen manga, tends to precede the inevitable question, yo, I wonder how much this guy can potentially blow up. When it comes to the scaling of Yu Yu Hakusho, people tend to go with either one of two routes. Either A, the feats that are shown throughout the series, or B, the lore/statements of the characters. And considering that both of these metas have an ample amount of evidence that could support either one of them, the fact remains that there has yet to come a definitive answer. From headcanon to the author using quote-unquote hyperbolic language, I have now taken it as my personal onus, as a new mega fan of this particular series, to prove which of these points is actually more valid. So if you happen to be a fan of Yu Yu Hakusho, or maybe you're just a fan of these types of videos in general, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, as videos like these are important for the power scaling community, especially considering the fact that a lot of people don't seem to understand this particular series, which is completely fair, due to Yu Yu Hakusho not being the most flashy or in-your-face series when it comes to its feats. It is no wonder this debate has lasted for over 30 years. So, I figured I would lay everything on the table, fully explaining every bit of evidence regarding this discussion, and hopefully with this new information that I've discovered in the Yu Yu Hakusho databook, this debate will be put to rest once and for all. So, with all that being said, let's begin. So, when discussing the topic of planet level Yu Yu Hakusho, there are essentially two key statements that would place the characters at this particular level. Number 1, Sensui states that he can't use more than half of his power in the human world, and Genkai claims that Yusuke is more than capable of destroying the world if he really wanted to. There are also a couple of supplementary statements that would also help to support these claims as well. However, these are the two major statements that are generally at the forefront of this discussion. Now, I can probably guess what some of you may be thinking. This is wank, it never happened, Sensui's a liar, etc, etc. However, instead of viewing these statements as being merely hyperbole, let's try to understand where the author is actually coming from. As it was stated in chapter 119 in the manga, demons that were ranked in the A and S classes were considered as significant threats to the planet. Sensui, who was confirmed to be at the level of an S-class demon in strength, would of course naturally scale to this statement. Now, to further back up this point, it's actually confirmed in the Yu Yu Hakusho databook that Sensui's sacred energy could literally impact the planet itself. Saint-like energy, or sacred energy, when perfected to its limit, it is as strong as that of an S-class demon and could even impact the planet itself. Now, okay, I hear you. Statements like these are considered extremely vague, as destroying the world or a planet or basically anything when it comes to a particular work of fiction tends to somewhat vary in its interpretation depending on that particular series. However, to break this down as thoroughly as possible, as I mentioned earlier with the A and S rank demons, it's actually emphasized much further in the manga that they are comparable in strength to hordes of B-class demons. To further emphasize this point, there are numerous occurrences that have been shown throughout the series where characters that are stated, or implied to be in a greater rank, can casually take out groups of lesser demons with absolutely no effort. For example, you could look at blatant situations like with Hiei, who was able to fight against weaker demons for months on end, Sensui who was able to dominate the A-class team Urameshi, or there's even the Demon King Lord Yomi, who was capable of taking out a group of exceptionally high-level demons while only exhibiting a fraction of his overall power. Now of course, there are many other examples that can be showcased that would also help to prove this point as well. However, the main pattern that I really want to emphasize here is that the distinction between these classes, or the classes in general, is basically heaven and earth. Also, B-class demons are allowed to come to Earth while A and S classes aren't, so that's kind of something to consider. Now, the next question that I want to answer, which I'm sure at this point you're all dying to know, is how strong are B-class demons? Well, if you remember from Koenma's statement in the manga, it is confirmed that the demon Toguro was ranked in the upper B-class level. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that during Genkai's later conversation with Yusuke, it can be implied that she's admitting that she herself is a threat to a country. Now, if you consider the fact that she scales to Toguro, or at least somewhat of maybe a portion of Toguro, you could therefore assume that Toguro himself is a threat to a country. Now, to further emphasize this point, in the 1993 October issue of V-Jump magazine, it is confirmed in a Q&A with the author Togashi that Kurama is a threat to the country of Japan. End quote. He likes to chop, and he often uses long leaves like swords and petals like razors. It seems that plants from the human world are not very suitable for weapons, but he says that sunflowers can be used like shotguns and cacti like bombs. Between ourselves, but if you are interested, cedar pollen can be used to kill almost everyone in Japan in a day. I just pray that he won't be capricious." End quote. Now, there are a ton of points in this statement that clearly need to be clarified, though I'll try to explain the key points as concisely as possible. Now, the first point of contention that some might bring up is that, well, since Togashi is claiming that Kurama is barely even a threat to a country, then wouldn't this kind of negate the whole planetary arguments? However, that's not necessarily the case. If you actually look at the date that this interview was held, which, for the record, was months before the series officially concluded, it was actually had during the course of the release of Volume 14. Volume 14, which of course contained the infamous chapter Black Art. Now, the reason this is important is that it helps to clarify the power scaling throughout this particular part in the series, as it is never formally emphasized until several chapters later, hence the statement where Genkai implies to being a threat to a country. And we know that Genkai was a top tier for most of the Dark Tournament, which these stats in question apply to a Kurama post the events of the Dark Tournament, and considering the general laws of power cliffing that most series follow to a degree, it would make perfect sense that this is the part of the story where the hero's rival if not surpass the previous god tiers. I mean, isn't that generally how these kinds of stories go? Also, just to clarify, this is only base Kurama that Togashi is referring to in this interview, which is pretty cool. Now, the next point that I want to cover, that's obviously going to have the most contention, is the wording of the statement itself. When talking about Kurama's abilities, Togashi states that cedar pollen can be used to kill almost everyone in Japan in a day, and he also adds that he prays that Kurama won't be capricious. Now, there are a few different ways you can interpret this statement. For one, you could choose to take this statement at face value, as not only is claiming to destroy a country a particularly broad statement, but it could just also be the author's definition as to what he thinks that they're capable of. Though, there are a few things I do want to point out. For one, it's specifically stated that Kurama can do this with weaker plants from the human world, which doesn't necessarily include his demonic plants, which would further amplify his power. Not to mention, there's also his Yoko form, which is also shown and stated to increase his stats. Also, given the specific time frame to which this Q&A had taken place, which if you actually notice occurred during the release of Volume 14, plus we never get many statements like this until much later in the series, it could kind of, be taken as Togashi's way of saying that, hey, here's a preview of what the characters can do if they wanted to, but it's not necessarily including their full potentials per se. Also, you have to consider the wording Togashi uses in this statement, quote unquote, he just prays that Kurama won't be capricious. Now, if you actually look up the word capricious, it means to be given over to sudden or unaccountable changes of mood or behavior. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that Togashi as a writer tends to focus on the emotional state of his characters, whereas if a character is emotionally stable, he can control his power to the fullest extent, or if a character's emotions are in disarray, bad things can potentially happen. Now, a really good example of this in the series is the leader of the Spirit World, King Enma. When explaining what would happen if Yusuke failed to recover the stolen artifacts, Quinma states that his father King Enma's anger would end up having a serious impact on both the spirit and human worlds. Now, considering that King Enma is stronger than the Kurama mentioned in this Q&A, and they both have a potential feat that's actually very similar in power, it's pretty obvious of the narrative intent of what's going on here. It's essentially saying that this is what would happen if the characters never controlled their emotions, and going by that particular action, they let their powers go out of control. Now, a much easier way to look at things is kind of like this. Say for example, Kurama's power is kind of like a dial, and when the dial is on the lowest setting, he can kill everyone in Japan in a day, or if the dial is set to the absolute max, he can literally bring Japan to ruin. Now, this would also segue into the conversations of AP versus DC, which, just to give a quick textbook definition, destructive capacity, also known as attack potency, is defined as the amount of energy, or also even damage, that a character, weapon, vehicle, or etc. can produce. Anyhow, to define this in terms of Yu Yu Hakusho is actually very simple. The characters are capable of focusing their powers to a single point, which is stated many times throughout the manga, as well as even the data book, which blatantly states that characters have an area of effect to their abilities. Now of course, there are those that will cling to ridiculous statements / ideas of, but wait, we never actually saw the characters destroy a country or not really much of anything for that matter, so how do we know they can actually do it? However, you also have to realize that not every series is like a Dragon Ball Z, or even a Naruto for example, where the characters can travel to a distant planet, or perhaps even an alternate dimension, and really show what they're capable of destroying. Most series, unfortunately, are centered around a specific area, and if that area were to, unfortunately, get destroyed because of some battle, then there wouldn't really be anywhere for the story to properly continue. I mean, me personally, I would have had the characters go all out and destroy the planet, and then just get Koima to bring everything back with his apparent wish-granting powers, which were never really touched on after the events of the Dark Tournament for some reason. I don't know, maybe they figured it'd be too much of a Dragon Ball ripoff and decided to completely drop the concept, but who knows, your guess is as good as mine. Anyway, now for those that will bring up the inevitable points of it mentioning that, well, doesn't it say that Kurama can kill most people in Japan in a day, and isn't it implied by Togashi that he might actually be the absolute strongest? However, there are two things to take note of here. For one, the reason it's saying that he can kill most people in Japan in a day, as opposed to the entire country, it's pretty much referring to the likes of Yusuke, Kuwabara, Hiei, and Genkai, maybe even that Kuroko Sanada chick who was a former spirit detective of Earth, but it's essentially referring to the characters who can protect themselves if Kurama was to ever go to the dark side. Also, and as for the whole statement of, well, perhaps Kurama might actually be the strongest, well, we do get direct confirmation in the manga that Yusuke actually scales to the upper B class Toguro, while Kurama more so scales to the middle B class Hiei, as they do both end up becoming A class demons at the same time, so the manga later gives us clarification explaining that specific ordeal. Alright, so now that all of that has been established and we've run the data through several possibilities, I think it's time to finally start answering the infamous question, can Yu Yu Hakusho characters actually destroy a planet? But before we dive any further into fully answering this question, I do want to clarify some of the evidence that I provided. Basically, we know that characters throughout the majority of the Chapter Black arc at least should be considered a threat to a country, as considering the statements made by characters in the manga, alongside the confirmation from the author himself, it would be fairly logical to come to that conclusion, as well as considering the fact that if Sensui is capable of destroying the planet, and it's not just a simple form of hyperbole, then it would make a lot of sense that this would be the tier of the previous arc, especially if you're looking from a linear perspective. Also, now there may be some people that bring up the fact that, well, doesn't it imply that A-class demons are a threat to a country, as opposed to the aforementioned B-class demons? However, that's kind of more so just an assumption. Another way you could also interpret it is that Yusuke was actually at the level of a B-class demon at the time of his apparent death, so him resurrecting with that potential degree of power would actually make sense from the perspective of the spirit world, as they kind of have this interpretation that all demons are rational beings of destruction that don't really give a f about anything. Although, if you actually sit and think about it, it wouldn't really make sense that they would actually destroy anything, as human beings are technically their main food supply. So it kind of begs the question, why would they destroy anything and risk cutting their literal lifeline off? I mean, wouldn't that be kind of self-defeating? However, that's just one way you could also interpret it. Now, another way that you could also interpret it is that if the statement is actually referring to A-class demons, which is more so implied by the story's narrative, then it's probably more so meant to be taken as a casual feat, and not really the highest of interpretations, as, just to clarify this point once again, we're given direct confirmation from the author in a Q&A, it's also directly implied by characters in the manga, and it's also shown clearly within the author's writing style. So, with that being said, if you take all this into consideration, calculating this question is actually very simple. Base Sensui, or I guess technically Minoru, is stated to be 10 times stronger than Yusuke, which, considering the evidence that I provided earlier, that'd make him 10 times above country level. Next, given the amp that he'd attained from his sacred energy, which can change depending on the translation of the manga, he'd get another anywhere from 10 or dozens of times of a multiplier. Next, considering the statement that was made for Awakened Demon Yusuke, which states that he's orders of magnitude above anything that was ever felt, and this would also include Sensui's earlier form by the way, he'd get another massive 10,000 plus times of a multiplier, simply considering that, well, for one, he's able to keep up with this Awakened Demon Yusuke, and two, many refers to 5 or more, and orders of magnitude refers to values of 10. Now of course, these calculations would vary, depending exactly on how you interpret the information, and I'll actually show a graph on screen that will help to explain the different results. However, as you can clearly see, even if you were to take the basic definitions of these statements, the characters would still reach those planetary levels, especially if you're considering the end of the series. Also, now I do want to talk about a couple feats that actually occurred throughout the series, which I can already guess what you're thinking. Yu Yu Hakusho and its non-existent feats, right? However, that opinion aside, there's a couple feats that I think people tend to genuinely overlook. For example, the first feat I want to talk about is Koenma's Mafukan. Now, the Mafukan in its lore is stated to be the strongest defensive weapon in the spirit world, which, if you happen to take that hyper literal, that would include the likes of the SDF, the mighty and powerful King Enma, and also, interestingly enough, the infamous Kakai Barrier. Now, what is specifically unique about the Kakai Barrier is that it envelops the entirety of the demon world, with the overall size of the demon world being one of the most debatable topics in the series. Anyhow, now I'm not going to go into detail about the demon world size in this video, however, I will just say this: it is confirmed to be endless in size in the manga, as well as having countries as numerous as the stars, and it's even confirmed in the Yu Yu Hakusho databook that its whole picture can't be comprehended. Anyway, now if you actually think the Mafukan scales to that level of energy, and you actually accept the demon world being that big in size, then them destroying the planet isn't the craziest thing to assume. Moving on, now another thing I want to talk about is the extra-dimensional cannon. Introduced in chapter 175 of the manga, it is stated to be an ancient superweapon that can actually go beyond dimensions and attack the other worlds. Now, in terms of some of its claims, it's not really the most impressive, as apparently it has the power to destroy Yusuke's hometown, and it's also stated to obliterate anything within a whopping 50-kilometer radius. However, that's nothing really special. Now, another aspect of it to consider is all the lore that's surrounding it, as apparently it has a laundry list of its supposed unique capabilities, which would include things such as, but of course not limited to, purging degeneracy amongst humans, causing natural disasters, and also even subjugating both the human and demon worlds. Now, if it is responsible for humanity's natural disasters, like the meteor that destroyed the dinosaurs, the word I'm not even going to try and pronounce, then it would suggest that it can reach those multi-continental level ranges, if not even a bit higher. Also, now I do want to point out the obvious reference to the superweapons of Star Wars, as they clearly have a similarity in function to some of them, especially if you consider things like the way that they are powered, as well as considering the fact that they can attack via the hyperspace. Now, of course, just a disclaimer, while I'm not saying it's an exact one-to-one comparison, as I don't really know if that was Togashi's actual intent. However, here's something interesting to consider for those unfamiliar with Star Wars. Now, these superweapons can actually range in their destructive capabilities, with some having the ability to take out cities, planets, or even entire star systems. Now, the star system stuff aside, as that's clearly the most outlandish, however, here's something that I want you guys to ponder. Now, there is shown to be 3 of those supposed superweapons, and we don't really know if they were created to be all the same strength, so I kinda want to throw out some crazy out there headcanon. Now, if the cannon that threatens the Earth is literally powered by the Earth, and the one that threatens the Demon World is potentially powered by the Demon World, and this same Demon World houses countries as numerous as the stars, then it's kinda self-explanatory what I'm suggesting. Now, another disclaimer, just to be clear, while I'm not saying it's gotta be exactly 100% that way, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it actually is. Anyway, now at this point, you guys pretty much get the picture right. I mean, given the evidence that I provided, it's fair to say that these guys can at least destroy a planet. I mean, I could of course go over other medias like the movie, the anime, and even certain video games that would essentially show and explain the same things. However, it'd pretty much just be a repeat. Although, now this is for those that are still on the skeptic side. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, all of this information sounds really good, but in the end, aren't feats always better than statements? Well, to put an end to this debate that's literally lasted for over 30 years, let's take a look at Togashi's interview with the North American branch of Shonen Jump. So, when asked how Togashi shows visuals when portraying motion and power in Yu Yu Hakusho, Togashi simply answers by stating the following: "No matter what, I try to make it easy for the reader to understand what's happening," meaning that if he says that a character can destroy the planet, then they can probably destroy the planet. Anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, hopefully you learned something. If you guys like Yu Yu Hakusho, please make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. If you guys have any suggestions for future videos, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. I'll be considering any and all comments. I'll actually be dropping a lot of Yu Yu Hakusho content, so please be on the lookout for that as well. I'll consider your suggestions for that as well. And with that being said, hopefully you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.